Hello students. This lesson will be on the 13 colonies. So as you know, we've been talking about exploration quite a bit. And so in the exploration, we know that the European countries were essentially trading from Europe to the Americas and from Africa to the Americas through the triangular trade. Where as a result of all of this triangular trade movement, we had the creation of colonies in the United States. So this is the area here that shows the colonies of the United States. All right. All right. So let me share with you a picture of the colonies. So one thing that you will learn, I've already learned, is that we have 13 colonies. But they are divided into 3 regions, and we'll be looking at that as we go through the lesson. So you have your southern colonies here that are in yellow, so these should be states familiar to you. You have the middle colonies, which include the largest being New York, and then you have the New England colonies, which the biggest one or the most populated of all of them was Massachusetts, Boston being the biggest port city. Maine was a part of Massachusetts, but it was not considered a part of the 13 colonies. All right. So, as usual, we're going to start with a little vocab. All right. So, let me pull this up. Okay, so when it comes to the 13 colonies, there's some really important vocab we need to remember. We will see this throughout the presentation, but I wanted to make sure that you understood what each one of these terms mean. All right, so the first one is a debtor. And so a debtor was someone who owed debt or money to a business or a person. If you were in Europe, debtors were kind of looked down upon. They were punished, jailed, even executed. And so if you were in debt to someone in Europe, you really wanted an opportunity to come to the Americas so that you can be free of that debt. The one colony that a lot of debtors went to was here in Georgia. Okay, so mercantilism. Mercantilism is a system in which the colonies supplied raw materials to Britain, otherwise known as the home country. Then Britain took those raw materials, like say cotton, and made them into manufactured goods, say cloth or textiles. The problem was that Britain would sell those manufactured goods back to the colonies. All right, so we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. All right, a treaty is an agreement, usually on paper, between 2 different countries or groups of people. During this time period, we would see a lot of treaties between Native Americans and Europeans. And a lot of them were broken, or the promise that was made in the treaty was not kept. All right, so we'll talk about that. Banishing happened in a lot of the New England and middle colonies here. Banishment meant that you did not behave according to the standards of a religious group or a colony, and so you were kicked out. So banishment was a big deal during the colonies because essentially you were going into the wilderness, or you had to find another colony to join a part of. So we saw a lot of this among the Pilgrims, but especially the Puritans, who were religiously very strict. Kind of related to banishment is a dissenter. A dissenter is someone who disagrees with the colonists. Many dissenters were not necessarily banished. Some of them could be, but they disagreed with how things were going. And so they were often quite vocal, or they spoke out against it. And so much so that they often left. And when we look at some of the religious groups, they're part of that. The Church of Latter-day Saints was one of the groups who established themselves in New York, and then their leader was a dissenter who left because they disagreed with the colonies that they came from. All right, harbor. A harbor is a port, a deep port. Let me put that in. For parking ships. And deep ports were in the north, meaning the New England colonies and middle colonies. So if you have a deep port where you can park ships, if it's deep, that means that you can park big ships. If you have big ships, that means that you can ship lots of products. Where were they shipping it? To England. So things like cotton and tobacco were really big as far as the shipping industry in the middle and the northeastern colonies. And so these deep harbors were really important to them. A tenant is someone who rents land or housing but promises to pay back in money or crops. So we would see this a lot, especially in the southern colonies, in the middle colonies, where poor people from England, especially who did not have land. England is small, it's an island country, and so they ran out of land. And so when some of the poor settlers came to the United States, they rented the land that they lived on for a certain period of time until they paid it off. Catholic, we're going to talk about two types of religions. They're both Christian. Catholics, this is a generalization, are Christians who see the Pope as a special messenger for God. So the Pope is important to them, as well as their priests play a more dominant role in the religious ceremonies. Protestants were a type of Christians who disagreed with the Catholics, and they believed that congregations or the members of a church did not need the Pope, but they can actually interpret and read the Bible for themselves. So meaning priests became preachers, people who guided individuals in reading the Bible and interpreted it for themselves, okay? So those are some of the important vocabulary words, and you'll see these as we go through the presentation. All right, so let's look at the details of the colonies. All right, so the 13 colonies are really important. You have some activities that you have done with the colonies or will do as far as mapping and understanding the economy and also labeling and knowing the regions. But we're going to go over the specific colonies in this particular lesson. All right, so Britain was the country in Europe that actually created the American colonies. And I want to show you the map real quick of Britain. Let's see, wrong one. All right, so if we look at the world map here, Britain is right here. So it's this island nation that is yellow. It's called, and on this map, the United Kingdom. This is a modern map, but back then it was called Britain. And so the British essentially were moving to this New England area here. All right, let me get out of this. All right, so why did Britain want the colonies? All right, so they want the colonies because of what we call mercantilism. And mercantilism stated that in order to increase wealth and power, a country must have a favorable balance of trade. So mercantilism is an economic relationship between two countries, and both countries are trying to sell more products to the other than buy products from the other country, and I'll explain that in just a second. All right, so in order to have a favorable balance of trade, a country needed to export, meaning send out products more than they imported, or those products that they bought from other countries. So let me say that one more time. A favorable balance of trade was when a country exported or sent products out to be sold more than they imported or bought products from another country. So that was important because you didn't want to gain money from exporting and then spend more money imported. That way you kind of lose profit, all right? So in other words, sell more of their stuff to other countries while buying very little from the countries that they bought it from. All right. Since most of the countries in Europe followed this idea of mercantilism, they needed to find new markets for their goods. And so markets such as furniture, textiles, things like that, those manufactured goods, they had to identify a place to sell them. And so they needed markets or places to sell their goods. And where was that market? It was the American colonies. All right, so again, the colonists, Britain is buying products from the Americas, then making them into manufactured goods, and then they're sold back to the colonies on these new markets that they're looking for. All right, so this is an explanation of, or a picture representation of mercantilism. So let's look at the favorable balance of trade, and this is the picture form. So in order to get a favorable balance of trade, you want more exports. So you're actually sending, let's see here. So yes, you're sending more things to other countries in order for them to buy it. And you want fewer imports, meaning those products that you're actually buying from another country. So you want to sell more than you buy. All right. Now, let's look at how all of this worked. All right. And this is really important because later when we talk about the American Revolution, this is going to be a big reason why the colonies wanted to separate from the mother country or England. All right. So we have the colonies, the 13 American colonies. Under mercantilism, they would sell these raw materials. So gold, silver, fur, lumber, food, cotton, eventually tobacco. It would be sent to the mother country, which was Britain. Now, why do we call Britain the mother country? Because the colonists were still British. Okay, they were not American yet. England, or the mother country, would make manufactured goods. So they would turn the cotton into cloth. They would turn the lumber into furniture. So these were manufactured goods that were sold back to the colonies. So why was this an issue? The colonies didn't like it because they were sending all the stuff to make the manufactured goods. And then Britain would turn around and sell those goods at a high price to the colonies. So the colonists really thought this was unfair. So mercantilism was a big issue in the colonies that again would lead to the American Revolution. So let's look at a video that will show you mercantilism. Go back.
Writing's not that easy, but Grammarly can help. This sentence is grammatically correct.
In this History Illustrated video, we're going to take a look at the word mercantilism. Now, mercantilism is an economic system. And if you don't remember what economic means, it is basically money. So it's a system in which somebody's going to make money. So the economic system is called mercantilism. Now, the countries that are going to primarily use mercantilism are these here, the ones that are in Europe. So the European countries, the big three is another word we may have used, the big three being Spain here, France here, and England here, are going to use this idea called mercantilism to gain power. So the idea is to gain power. They want to get a lot of power. And the way they were going to do it was to travel across the world and start colonies in random places. The best places that have very good raw materials, the things they could use to make money. So raw materials could then be sent over to England, Spain, or France. They could collect it all, turn them into manufactured goods. So they can turn them into manufactured goods. And then they can send them back out and to sell them. So they're going to sell everything. The idea behind mercantilism is to control colonies. So they are going to control them, and they're going to force them to send all their stuff to these big three countries. They are not allowed to trade between each other at all. So they are not allowed to have any kind of business between each other. They have to do business with what you would call the mother country. The mother countries would be the big three over here. So Spain, France, and England. So mercantilism's main goal is to give power to the mother country. So mercantilism, power to the mother country by controlling colonies and forcing them to trade with the mother country.
All right, so let's get out of that.
Good grammar and spelling are important, but if you want to write
All right. All right, so that was mercantilism. So let's look at the types of charters, and you'll have to know these types of colonies. I'm sorry. The types of colonies would determine what would happen or what type of colony that was created. So the first type of colony was called a charter colony. So a charter is a document issued by a government, usually a king or queen, that gave individuals certain rights. So charters were different depending upon which country it came from. Well, for most American colonies, or actually all of them, the king came from Britain, all right? And so in a charter colony, the British king allowed their colonists to establish their own government. So a lot of times in charter colonies, they were actually independent from the king. While it's important because when Britain decided they were going to put a lot of pressure on the colonies, well, they were already independent, and so they felt like the British were interfering in what they created. A lot of them were created by joint stock companies. So we talked about joint stock companies before. It's when investors kind of joined in order to create a new colony. If the colony worked, then they made money. If it didn't work, they did not. So really a charter colony started by a joint stock company was kind of risky. So some best examples are Plymouth and the Massachusetts Bay Colony, which we'll look at. All right, so what is a charter? We know that a charter is a document from a king allowing a colony to begin. And who granted a charter to a colony? Obviously, I just said a king or monarch in Britain specifically. All right, the second type is a proprietary colony. So a proprietary colony was a colony that was given to an individual by the king or queen. And in response to that, because they were allowed to govern and take over what was considered a harsh process of creating a colony, these individuals were granted huge tracts of land. So if you were the special person who the king or queen liked and you wanted to take the risk to create a colony in the Americas, then you were given land off the jump once you got there, and then you were responsible for the success of that colony, and you certainly had to answer to the British king or queen. Example was New Jersey. All right, and the third type of colony was called the royal colony. So royal, this is quite obvious, royal meaning king or queen, so they were under the control of the British queen. All the colonies would eventually be owned and under the rule of the British monarch, even though they were so far away that they rarely had very specific control. They just waited for reports from the leaders of the various colonies instead of being directly involved. Okay, so under a proprietary colony, who supervised and governed the colony? Of course, it was the individual, and then what were they given in return? Money. Okay, and then we know what a royal colony is. All right. Real quick, we talked about this before. A joint stock company was the company that raised money to fund the colony. And so most colonies were created by joint stock companies. And it was an expensive endeavor. Again, like I said, if the colony was established and went well, then the people who invested in the company made money. If it didn't go well, they lost money. All right. And that's basically what I said here. All right. How was money raised to fund a joint stock company? It was raised by shareholders or investors. All right. So let's look at some of the specific colonies. So the first one is the Virginia colony. Why do we talk about them first? Because the first permanent settlement, there was one settlement or colony beforehand, but Jamestown in Virginia was the first permanent settlement in the Americas. All right. So it was a southern colony. Remember, we have 3 regions. So this was a southern colony. It was settled by the British. And the first British settlement actually was not Jamestown, it was Roanoke. And this was actually in North Carolina around this area. All right, Roanoke was the first settlement, but it was not the first permanent settlement because it did not survive. All right, but we know the first permanent was Jamestown. All right, so this is a map of Roanoke. If you can tell, this is part of Virginia, and then this is part of North Carolina here. So this is the coastline of North Carolina with the Outer Banks being here. So Wilmington would be about there if you've ever been to Wilmington. All right. So by 1587, 100 men, women, and children settled on Roanoke Island, which is out here on the coast, under the leadership of John White. The settlement eventually became a part of North Carolina, as I mentioned. But it didn't survive. Virginia Dare was the first European born in America, so that's one thing to remember about Roanoke. And then it was soon settled by other people, but then they really didn't know the territory. It was the first time they saw wooded land. The land in England looked much different. And so they had a real serious problem with supplies. But eventually, some of John White, along with some of his colleagues, returned back to England or Britain to gather more supplies. And this is a picture of the Roanoke. All right. It's called the Lost Colony because it took nearly 3 years for that first group who left for supplies to return. And when they returned, they realized that the settlement was deserted. There was no one there. All right. The only clue was the word Croatan that was carved on one of the palisades, and then the letter C-R-O carved into a nearby tree. Well, who were the Croatan? The Croatan were the Native Americans who actually lived in the Roanoke area, and that was their land in which the English were encroaching upon. All right. And this is a picture of what the settlers who came back to save the Lost Colony or Roanoke Colony. This is a picture of the tree that they found when they returned that said Croatan on it. All right. John White was certain the messages meant that the settlers were living among the Croatan Indians, which was true on Hatteras Island. And they never had a chance to find out because stormy weather made it impossible for them to search for settlers. And so John White and his people returned to England. And despite several attempts, they were never able to raise funds to return to America. So that's why Roanoke was called the Lost Colony, because essentially people disappeared and never became a permanent settlement. So let's look at the quick video on this Roanoke settlement. All right, this is kind of a modern day review of it.
Knock, knock. Your Nutrisystem delivery is here with a month of delicious meals satisfying.
Scientists could be closer to solving a mystery more than 400 years old here in America. Why about 100 of the earliest colonists disappeared from Roanoke Island on the North Carolina coast. Archaeologists are now digging about 60 miles inland in Mary Hill. They have so far found artifacts that they say could indicate some of the settlers wound up there. This new lead came from a centuries-old map at the British Museum where a hidden symbol marked the spot. We're joined by Bly Strobe, part of the dig from the beginning and curator of the First Colony Foundation. Welcome. This is a very exciting day to you, for you. You have revealed some of the first information, some of the first artifacts that you've been able to uncover there.
Yes, this is work that's been going on for quite a while now, but we are just now sort of feeling confident enough to release some of this information.
They've made movies about the Lost Colony and so forth. The first English-born child, Virginia Dare, we've all read about her in the history books. She was born there. More than 100 people settled on Roanoke Island in 1587. And then 3 years later, when the ship that delivered them came back, they were gone.
Yes, I'm sure they had to leave to find sustenance, ways to provide for themselves. Our theory is that they didn't go as a group, that they probably divided up. It would have been very difficult to feed 100 people. If they found a friendly Indian group and said, hey, here we are, please feed us, that would have been rather difficult. So we think they split up. And the place we're looking right now, we believe, is one of those areas that a small group settled on.
The spot actually involves almost a hidden message in that treasure map that I referenced earlier that you found at the British Museum. Tell us about that.
Yes, that was quite exciting because that map, which was drawn in the late 16th century by John White, who was the leader of the Lost Colony, has been in the British Museum since the late 19th century. And no one questioned the patches that were on the map.
There were little plugs of paper, in essence, where it looked like there had been a mistake made.
Exactly. So one of our team, one of the First Colony Foundation, asked the British Museum to see the back of the map. Well, the back of the map shows you nothing whatsoever. But what they did also was shine a light through it, so they backlit it, and lo and behold, this fort form starts showing up underneath. We could not believe it. It was just incredible.
So that is what led you to the spot where you're digging now, what, about 50 miles to the north and east of where Roanoke Island is?
Well, that is exactly what had been written in the records, that the colony was to go 50 miles into the main, which means into the mainland. And we had done some surveys in that area back in 2007, and really hadn't thought too much of it until this map shows up, and we thought, wow, we've got to look at this again. They brought the material to me, and my specialty is looking at artifacts and giving them dates and context, figuring out what they are. And I saw some very interesting early, especially ceramics, in that collection.
There is also the theory, though, that Native Americans simply didn't want these invaders in their presence and killed them all. Is that a possibility?
Yes, there is that. Some of the poor colonists may have ended up in an area where they were killed by the natives. That is in the records. And Powhatan, the chief that talks to the Jamestown colonists and said, oh, I'll tell you what happened to them. I had them wiped out. And he actually showed them some English artifacts that he had. But whether he was really telling the truth or not, we don't know. He just may have been trying to intimidate the English.
And you found artifacts at this new dig site that suggest to you that some of the lost colonists ended up there.
Yes, we found in particular two types of ceramic. One is made on the western coast of England, and is part of a tall jar that was used to ship dried fish. So that's the kind of vessel that would go on ships going across the ocean. There's no other reason for it to be there unless it were brought by the lost colonists. And the other is a type of ceramic that's found in the south of London in England. And it is the type that's very prominent in London in the 16th century.
Fascinating stuff. Bly Strobe from the Roanoke Island Colony, First Colony Foundation. Thank you.
All right, so as you
welcome.
can
Good luck with your
see,
dig.
Thanks.
so as you can see, historians are always revising history. So it was called the Lost Colony because there's still a mystery around what happened to its inhabitants. And so the person that you saw on that news clip was an archaeologist. You also saw pictures of some of her team digging into the ground to find pottery, tools, walls, and other things that would help them figure out what happened to the Lost Colony. All right. All right, so we're going to go through Jamestown very briefly because you've had an entire lesson on this. So we know it was Virginia Company, a joint stock company of London, and it was established off the coast of Virginia. And I'm going to fast forward through these real quick because we don't need these. I already talked about them. All right, remember that tobacco, that was big. All right, so let's look at Massachusetts. So one of the biggest of the northern colonies or New England colonies. It was settled by Pilgrims and Puritans. And one thing that was very unique about Massachusetts is that it was created for religious reasons. All right, so there were people who were being persecuted by the kings and queens of Britain. At that time, Britain was a part of the Church of England, and Pilgrims and Puritans did not agree with the Church of England, and so they created their own separatist groups, often entering into battles with the kings and queens soldiers back in Britain. So they wanted to come to the colonies to establish a colony that was allow religious freedom. All right, problem was it wasn't full religious freedom. It was religious freedom according to what the Pilgrims thought and according to what the Puritans thought. So if you weren't a Pilgrim or a Puritan, then you didn't have freedom. So we have to take that religious freedom with a grain of salt, so to speak. All right, so what's the difference between Pilgrims and Puritans? So Pilgrims were called separatists. They wanted to separate from the Church of England, all right? They wanted to be free of royal control. So the Church of England was controlled by the King of England, and they didn't want a part of it. So they traveled on the Mayflower to Plymouth, Massachusetts, So they were the first to arrive in the New England period. Then you had the Puritans, and the Puritans wanted life pure. They wanted things as simple and focused as possible, and they were heavily religious to the point in which they persecuted and banished, one of our words, banished their colonists for not following very strict rules. They wanted to purify the Church of England. They thought that back in Britain, the Church of England had been corrupt, and so they wanted to have no parts of that. All right. All right, so the Plymouth colony itself was where the Pilgrims were. They had settled there. And here's a picture of the Plymouth colony that's pretty common. All right, so let's look at the difference. I always do that. Let's look at the difference between the Pilgrims and the Puritans.
It might surprise you to learn that Pilgrims and Puritans are not the same thing. While the term pilgrim can mean any group that makes a journey because of religion, in American history it means one distinct group. Both Pilgrims and Puritans came to the New World to settle, and both had religious backgrounds. But there are a lot of differences too. The Pilgrims arrived first, landing in Plymouth around 1620. They were separatists, which meant they disagreed so strongly with the Church of England they wanted to separate from it and form their own church. Originally, the group moved to the Netherlands, but they became concerned that living there would make them lose their language and cultural identity. So they began making plans to settle a colony in the New World. The plan was to land in Virginia, but a storm blew the ship off course, and they ended up settling in New England. It was the Pilgrims who celebrated the first Thanksgiving after surviving their first year in America. The Puritans arrived 10 years later, starting the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Like the Pilgrims, the Puritans had problems with the Church of England. But unlike the Pilgrims, they didn't want to separate from the church. Instead, they wanted to fix the church from within it, or purify it. Hence the name Puritans. There were more Puritans in England than separatists, so Massachusetts Bay Colony began to grow as more and more people arrived. Eventually, as the Puritans' population and influence expanded, the two groups merged and spread. Together, their influence can still be found all over New England and even the whole United States.
All right, so as you can see, the Pilgrims and the Puritans were different. The Puritans were separatists. They wanted to be completely separate from the Catholic Church. The Church of England. The Puritans wanted to change the Church of England. So they weren't totally in disagreement with the Church of England. They just wanted to make it more pure and less corrupt. So just remember the difference. The Pilgrims came first, and then the Puritans came separately, creating Massachusetts colony. All right, so let's look at the the Plymouth colony. This is where the Pilgrims were. 35 Pilgrims served on the Mayflower, and it was near the Hudson River. The colony would eventually, area would be a part of the Virginia colony. All right, and they set out after 60 days at sea. They finally anchored at Cape Cod in Massachusetts on the Mayflower. You all should remember this. And they decided not to continue the journey and to instead look for a suitable place nearby. So they were on their way to New York, but they decided to just stay and settle in Cape Cod, Massachusetts. All right. They lived among the Wampanoag Native American community, and they also had the benefit of a good water supply, a good harbor for ships, one of our words, and cleared fields in order to farm and to, of course, farm for food and eventually farm for cash crops. All right, let's move quickly through here. One thing to remember is the Mayflower Compact. This was the agreement for the colony that established it as a colonial government. So a compact is an agreement between the mother country, Britain, and the people who founded it, the Pilgrims. All right, it was the first self-government plan in the colonies. So it actually had a plan of what the rules and procedures were for people who lived in the colonies. All right, let's skip that. right, we'll move a little past here. All right, half the settlers died. Squanto was a Native American group. There was a Wampanoag leader. He helped them out. As a result, they had their first harvest, which they celebrated with the Pilgrims. And this was the modern day Thanksgiving. There's a lot of current controversy around this as to whether they were actually friendly or not, but all evidence points in the direction that it was a friendly interaction. All right, so let's look at Massachusetts Bay. That's where the Puritans settled. All right. It was a charter colony, meaning there was a document that was signed between the colonists and King George II and allowed for 1,000 Puritans. John Winthrop, important person, he actually led the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Remember, the Massachusetts Bay Colony was settled by Puritans, and so he saw it as a religious movement. And one of his most famous quotes is, "We shall be a city upon a hill. The eyes of the people are on us." So a city upon a hill is high, and that means it's closer to God. So that's what he meant by that. And that's John Winthrop. Puritan laws were really strict, and they were tied to the beliefs of the church. Dissenters, that was one of our words, were people who didn't follow Puritan laws. There were punishments for those who were dissenters: fines, public humiliation, execution, like hangings, and banishment. We talked about banishment before. Some of the dissenters, or people who disagreed, left and created other New England colonies. All right. Quakers were one of those groups who left and ended up going to the Pennsylvania, or establishing the Pennsylvania colony. 20,000 English joined the Puritans by 1643. One thing to remember, in most colonies, only male members could vote. Members of the church could vote. In most colonies, male gentlemen or wealthy people were the only ones to have the vote. Women didn't have the right to vote until 1920. All right. So it became the largest and most influential of all the northern or New England colonies, and it basically swallowed up the Plymouth colony where the Pilgrims were. And then it became a royal colony afterwards. All right, Rhode Island, was a New England colony. It was settled by Roger Williams. Going through this a little fast. All right, Roger Williams was banished from Massachusetts, so he was one of the dissenters for speaking out against the authorities. He disagreed with some of the religion, and he was against the confiscation or the taking of Native American land. So he was a little bit more peaceful of an individual. He founded Rhode Island, where there was no religious persecution or punishment of Christians, and that's a picture of him. Connecticut. So Connecticut was, again, another New England colony. So we're looking at these colonies here. It was settled by Thomas Hooker. And they created the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. So it was the first constitution. A constitution, we have one, is a list of the rights and rules, the rights of the people and the rules of the government. And constitutions are built to protect people from government tyranny or too much government control. All right. Unlike Massachusetts, citizenship was based on land ownership, not religion. So if you own land, then you were considered to be a citizen under the written Constitution, Fundamental Orders. All right, so skip that one so we can go through. New Hampshire, again, another New England colony. David Thompson was the settler. New Hampshire was important. They were a part of the New England colonies. They were especially known for fishing, but not for religious freedom. But we want to remember fishing there because a lot of the colonies up north, they would make a lot of money in fishing. All right. After being exiled from Massachusetts Bay Colony for being a dissenter, that word again, John Wheelwright actually established New Hampshire as one of the smaller colonies. And it had no religious ties. So there wasn't a particular religion that you were required to be a part of. And then New Hampshire became its own colony in 1769. All right, so what about Vermont and Maine, the last two? So Vermont was declared independent from Great Britain in 1771. It refused to be acknowledged as separate from New York until 1791, when it was admitted as the 14th state. Maine, as I mentioned before, is part of Massachusetts until it became the 23rd state a little bit further along. All right. Now, one of the most famous of the events during the colonies, and this happened in Massachusetts among the Puritans, was called the Salem Witch Trials. They happened in the fall of 1692. And it was probably the best example of how strict the Puritans were and the extent to which they would go in order to punish people who were dissenters or who were disagreed with how they did things. So young girls who within the village were claimed to be possessed by the devil, they had gone into the woods and had kind of done some things with what they call voodoo and kind of other religious practices that were not accepted by the Puritans. They were caught doing it, and so they were, like many people, accused of witchcraft. So by the time all the witch trials ended, 150 people were imprisoned for witchcraft, all right? And then 19 of the men and women were found guilty and hanged, and one person was crushed to death for refusing to testify and say that she was a witch. And so you can see just how strongly the Puritans controlled the people within their colonies and how strict they were. It ended in September 1692 when public opinion turned against the trials. So let's look at the Salem Witch Trials, a little overview real quick.
Who is whiteboardanimation.com? We're the original white.
You've been accused of a crime you did not commit. It's impossible to prove your innocence. If you insist that you're innocent anyway, you'll likely be found guilty and executed. But if you confess, apologize, and implicate others for good measure, you'll go free. Do you give a false confession or risk a public hanging? This was the choice facing those accused of witchcraft in the village of Salem, Massachusetts, between February 1692 and May 1693. They were the victims of paranoia about the supernatural, misdirected religious fervor, and a justice system that valued repentance over truth. Salem was settled in 1626 by Puritans, a group of English Protestants. Life was strict and isolated for the people of Salem. Battles with their Native American neighbors and groups of French settlers were commonplace. People feared starvation and disease, and relations between villagers were strained. To make matters worse, 1692 brought one of the coldest winters on record. That winter, two cousins, 9-year-old Betty Paris and 11-year-old Abigail Williams, started behaving very strangely. A physician found nothing physically wrong, but diagnosed the girls as under an evil hand. Puritans believed that the devil wreaked havoc in the world through human agents, or witches, who blighted nature, conjured fiendish apparitions, and tormented children. As news swept through the village, the symptoms appeared to spread. Accounts described 12 so-called afflicted girls contorting their bodies, having fits, and complaining of prickling skin. 4 of the girls soon accused 3 local women of tormenting them. All 3 of the accused were considered outsiders in some way. On February 29th, the authorities arrested Sarah Good, a poor pregnant mother of a young daughter, Sarah Osborne, who had long been absent from church and was suing the family of one of her accusers, and Tituba, an enslaved woman in Betty Paris's home known by her first name only. Tituba denied harming the girls at first, but then she confessed to practicing witchcraft on the devil's orders and charged Good and Osborne with having forced her. Osborne and Good both maintained their innocence. Osborne died in prison, while Good's husband turned against her in court, testifying that she was a witch or would be one very quickly. Good's 4-year-old daughter was imprisoned and eventually gave testimony against her mother. Meanwhile, Good gave birth in jail. Her baby died, and she was convicted and hanged shortly thereafter. Tituba was held in custody until May and then released. These 3 victims were just the beginning. As accusations multiplied, others, like Tituba, made false confession to save themselves. The authorities even reportedly told one accused witch that she would be hanged if she did not confess and freed if she did. They were not particularly interested in thoroughly investigating the charges. In keeping with their church's teachings, they preferred that the accused confessed, asked for forgiveness, and promised not to engage in more witchcraft. The court accepted all kinds of dubious evidence, including so-called spectral evidence, in which the girls began raving when supposedly touched by invisible ghosts. Complicating matters further, many of the jurors in the trials were relatives of the accusers, compromising their objectivity. Those who dared to speak out, such as Judge Nathaniel Saltonstall, came under suspicion. By the spring of 1693, over 100 people had been imprisoned, and 14 women and 6 men had been executed. By this time, accusations were starting to spread beyond Salem to neighboring communities, and even the most powerful figures were targets. When his own wife was accused, the governor of Massachusetts colony suspended the trials. Sentences were amended, prisoners released, and arrests stopped. Some have speculated that the girls were suffering from hallucinations caused by fungus, or a condition that caused swelling of the brain. But ultimately, the reason for their behavior is unknown. What we do know is that adults accepted wild accusations by children as hard evidence. Today, the Salem witch trials remain a cautionary tale of the dangers of groupthink and scapegoating and the power of fear to manipulate human perception.
All right, so as you can see, the Salem witch trials was a perfect example of how the Puritans persecuted each other and used religion in order to persecute and to execute people. It was eventually found out through historians a little bit later that those people who were accusing people of witches wanted their land. So it was really about land and power and less about religion. All right. All right, so real quick, the climate of the New England colonies was rocky. The crops, it was made growing crops difficult. There were waterways and harbors, though, where fishing and shipbuilding, which would be huge later, could be allowed because you had those deep water harbors or ports. They have forests for trapping fur, beaver fur, and timber for lumber. And this made a lot of commerce or business happen. So New England became quite rich, and of course became a key part of triangular trade, which we looked at before. All right, New York is a middle colony settled by the Dutch. The Dutch called it New Netherlands and eventually became New York City. It was also called New Amsterdam. I knew that was a little confusing there. And I'm gonna go through these pretty quickly. Henry Hudson explored, so we know about Henry Hudson from before, and he claimed the territory of what we now know as New York for Dutch, which will eventually become under English control. All right, and we'll skip over some of these. All right. These are some details you don't need to know. All right. So New Jersey was a middle colony, and it was established by the Dutch. So John Bergen became the New Jersey's first European settlement, the city of Bergen. The New Jersey was part of New Netherlands until they took control of it. Let's move to New Jersey. All right. So in New Jersey is the Duke of York gave land between the Hudson River and the Delaware Rivers to 2 of his friends. These 2 areas were named New Jersey. All right. And then New Jersey was also settled. The western part of New Jersey was settled by the Quakers, which were a peaceful group we'll look at in a second. And it was divided into East and West Germany and eventually became a royal colony. All right, so now I'm going through these quickly. All right, so a really important of the middle colonies was William Penn. And so William Penn was known for an important leader because he was a Quaker. All right. So William Penn, this is a charter, received a charter from King Charles II to establish Pennsylvania. He saw it as a holy experiment. So he wanted a place without wealthy people taking control, and he wanted every male to receive 50 acres of land and the right to vote. So as you can see, the Quakers, or the people in the Pennsylvania colony, were a lot more open to religious and political rights than the other ones. All right. All right, William McCann became a Quaker. So that's another religious group. We looked at the Pilgrims, Puritans, now the Quakers. They're known as the Society of Friends. If you live in Greensboro, you should be familiar with Guilford College. Guilford College is out Friendly Avenue. They are known as the Society of Friends. Guilford College was created by Quakers, and they actually have several churches there where they still meet. And they were a part of the Underground Railroad, which we'll look at later. All right. So they were often ridiculed because they kept things really simple. They rejected rituals in church like kneeling, praying, communion, things like that. And they were also pacifists, so they were anti-war. All right, Delaware, middle colony, set up by New Sweden. And some quick points about that. So the British Duke of York and the colony of New York gained control of Delaware. But then William Penn was given control. Remember, he had to start at Pennsylvania, so he took Delaware as a part of Pennsylvania. And then eventually Delaware separated from Pennsylvania to start its own colony. So a lot of stuff going on there. All right, so middle colonies were great for farming. So please remember that. Corn, wheat, other things. And then because of the Hudson and Delaware rivers, they were able to trade with harbor towns, especially the colony of Massachusetts. What were some of the things that grew? Vegetables, wheat, oats, raised livestock, fruits, and then corn was really important for later. All right. They also were loggers and ship builders, and were involved in fishing. So they were really important as far as that was concerned. All right, so I'm going to skip a little bit so we can get through. All right, the Southern colonies were set up by Lord Baltimore. Maryland was different. Yes, it is a Southern colony. If you are from there, have people from there, it seems almost like a northern city, but it was a southern city. I mean, it was a southern state, excuse me. And it grew tobacco and had slavery and plantations just like the other southern colonists. All right, so Lord Baltimore established it as a Catholic colony. So remember, Catholic meaning that they believed that the Pope was closest to God and spoke for God, so among other things. So he granted them Maryland, 100 million acres of land. It was a proprietary colony. So the owner of the colony was the ruler, not the king and the queen. And then Baltimore offered 100 acres to every married couple. So, of course, marriage is considered big in the Catholic religion, and so they wanted to encourage that. And also, if people were married, they're more likely to have children, so they could grow that population. All right. All right, they passed the Toleration Act of 1649, which granted, religious freedom to all Christians living in Maryland. So at first it was Catholic, but then they changed it so you had religious freedom there. All right, and that is kind of a picture of the actual one. All right, so we're almost finished. Let's look at the Carolinas. And the reason why we have Carolinas here is because North and South Carolina were originally one colony or area. So it was a southern colony, all right, which we know, supported by King Charles II. 8 supporters landed in the Carolinas, actually in what is now called North Carolina, our current state. And because the Carolinas were important because it gave easy access to the West Indies. So let me get out of this for a second and go back. And let's look at the map. So if we're talking about the southern colonies with North Carolina being here, that's closer to the West Indies and the Caribbean than if you were way up north in the New England colonies. So that's what gave them the advantage there. All right, and let's open this back up. All right. Alrighty. All right, so the big thing about Carolinas, like all southern colonies, please remember this, are cash crops. This is how they became rich. Tobacco and cotton were the biggest, cotton becoming the absolute biggest a little bit later on. But we know cash crops were sold for the purpose of selling. So if you own land and you had people to work your land that could grow tobacco or cotton or other products, then you could sell it for a profit, close to 100% profit. So we saw that in the Carolinas. And we know that it was labor intensive or required a lot of workers to do those cash crops. And then of Carolina, of course, the first slaves came in 1719, but by 1720, enslaved Africans outnumbered European settlers in the Carolinas 2-1. So South Carolina, that's why there's a large African-American population there, and in fact, more African-Americans than Caucasian citizens. Well, it came from the establishment of the Carolina colony in 1720. All right, so let's finish this up real quick. All right, so 1729, Carolina became a part of the royal colony. It was split into North and South Carolina. So this happened in 1729, which is why we have two different states, one in the North, one in the South. Last one, Georgia. So Georgia is the last of the southern colonies. And it was started by General James Oglethorpe in 1732. Now, Georgia was a little different. It was established because it protected South Carolina with the Spanish in Georgia. So let me exit out of this and show you where that is. Okay. All right. Let me pull up the right map here. We find it. All right. Sorry about that. Okay, so Georgia was here the Carolinas. So South Carolina was really threatened by the Spanish. And if you remember back when we talked about the explorers, the Spanish were all in here, and they were, of course, enemies of the English. So Georgia was settled for one reason, so that they can protect the English from Florida. So you had a lot of soldiers that were there. All right, so just wanted to show you that. Also, it was a place for debtors, people who were in debt, so they kind of went there to live, to try to escape Britain and the money that they owed. And though it never became really a debtor colony, that's how it at least got started. All right. And the economy of the southern colonies, cash crops, tobacco, rice became big, especially in South Carolina, because rice grows in swampy areas. Indigo was big in South Carolina also. It's actually the color purple, and it was used to dye clothes, and indigo was a popular color then. It's a dark, dark purple. And then cotton, all need the big labor force. The South was mostly farms and plantations, so they did not have large cities. The biggest city early on was Charleston, and then a little bit later it was New Orleans, and then of course in parts of Virginia we have Washington, D.C. and other large cities in the South, which we'll talk about. Not as much trading. Why? Because we did not have those deep water ports. So if you've been to the beach in North Carolina, you know it's shallow. You can jump into the water and you can go quite a bit out and your feet touch the ground. But so that meant that you couldn't get big ships close to land in order to trade products. So all the cash crops that were grown in the southern colonies were actually sent up north in the New England and middle colonies, which shipped them out to England. So everybody really benefited from cash crops. And we know that cash crops were actually grown and harvested by slaves. All right, and then we'll watch this last video here.
Get ready, because K-5 Science is here. Let's explore. In this History Illustrated video, I'm going to talk to you about the southern colonies. So let me go ahead and write that down. The southern colonies. Now, as you would guess, the southern colonies are located down here in the south. And because they're in the south, they're warm. I'm going to talk to you a lot more about that in the following video. However, it does play a part in this particular video here. So I'm going to go ahead and start. The very first colony in the history of the United States was Jamestown, Virginia. Now, Jamestown was the name of the town. Virginia was the name of the colony. Okay, Jamestown was the very first one. It was started in 1607 for some money. So, Jamestown, 1607, it was started by a company looking to make some money. It's a very different story from Plymouth, which was started for religion. So, Jamestown, 1607, money. I'm going to go ahead and turn that away now. And I'm going to go ahead and focus on just telling you one at a time. Let's start with Virginia. Like I said, Virginia was the very first colony. Jamestown was located right about there, and that was 1607. And they were started for money. The way they were going to make money was with agriculture. I've made a couple of videos discussing agriculture and manufacturing, which were the main economies at the time. You might want to check those out. So, agriculture was the main purpose of Virginia. The particular crop that was going to help them out was tobacco. So that was the major crop of the time. They wanted to grow tobacco because it was a cash crop, which means it makes a lot of cash essentially. It's something that you can grow and it'll turn into a lot of cash for you. So that's Virginia, the very first colony. The next one I want to talk to you about is something very similar. North Carolina and South Carolina. They used to be just called Carolina, but they were divided in half eventually because they were very different. As the people from Virginia were moving and spreading out and creating more and more farms to grow their tobacco, the people also moved further into North Carolina. So there's a lot of small farmers, people that were getting their freedom from indentured servitude that were moving in, and they weren't all that rich. They just had a lot of farms, a lot of small farms, and they were making a little bit of money. Now, South Carolina was a totally different story. We had a lot of very rich people that were building very large farms called plantations. They didn't really feel like they mixed with the people in Northern Carolina very well, so they were both wanted to be a part of their own colony. They didn't have the same ideas on how they wanted to run the colony, so they wanted to both split into two different ones. So that's how you wind up with North Carolina and South Carolina. Now remember, because of plantations, they were both about making money in agriculture as well, growing tobacco in the north especially, and down south maybe rice or indigo. Now I want to talk to you about Maryland. Right above them we have Maryland. Was the one colony in the South that was started for religious freedom, and it was started for religious freedom for the Catholics. It was originally a Catholic colony. They named it Maryland because if you look at it, Mary and then land. If you've ever noticed, Catholics typically will pray to the Virgin Mary, so they named it in honor of her, Maryland, and today we just call it Maryland. So it was started for the Catholics, but eventually they would invite other religions in as well because they needed to sell some land. They were trying to make money there. So they invited anybody there. So it has a unique story in the South, but they too would also learn to focus on agriculture as the time went on. And then the very bottom, we have Georgia. This is a very unique colony because it was started for money, but in a very different way. It was started for people called debtors. These people are in debt, which means they owe money. So it was started for people that owed money so they can move there, make some money, and get out of debt. All right, that's it for the 13 colonies.
All righty. All right, so that's the end of our lesson. Whew, that was quite a bit. Make sure you go back and review the lesson. We went through a lot, so you may have to go back, take notes, and stop and start. All right. Thank you very much.